Good afternoon, and thank you, Wyoming Law Review, for putting together such an extraordinary symposium. What a great day it's been so far. I am certainly comfortable introducing the guest of honor as my family's close friend, Mr. Chuck Box. Chuck and I share a love of all things outdoors, including hunting, fly fishing, and rodeo. I think his wife Lori and I probably like horses more than Chuck does, though. The Boxes and the Boomgaardens share the blessing of having raised talented and successful daughters, and we now relish the time we can spend with our grandchildren. We have lots of mutual friends, little trouble ribbing each other, and know how to have a lot of fun. I'd be remiss if I didn't make sure that you all knew about his longtime habit of putting the names of friends and acquaintances in his novels. He usually donates that naming opportunity as an auction item for Wyoming charities and their fundraising events. It's been estimated that his name in a book auctions have raised over $500,000 for Wyoming charities. Now, I've put a few of these up on occasion, but I've never won the prize. And I do have to acknowledge that Boomgaarden probably isn't an obvious choice. And for reasons that will soon become clear, I doubt that I'll ever appear as a heroine in one of his novels. The fact is I am not very comfortable, and I'm standing here with terrible imposter syndrome when it comes to introducing C.J. Box, the author. Why, you might ask? Well, in the interest of full disclosure, and C.J. knows this, I haven't read many of his books. You see, if I read fiction, I turn to historical fiction. I'm just not drawn to murder mystery or crime drama. And legal drama, let's just say I have a hard time getting past literary license. Now, my daughter from North Carolina was here a few weeks ago, and I mentioned this dilemma that I faced, having agreed to introduce CJ, the author. She rolled her eyes at me, typed into her phone for about 10 seconds, and texted me a saucy AI-generated introduction. "Start here," she said. So according to ChatGPT, CJ is, and I'm quoting, "one of the most distinctive voices in contemporary American fiction." Going on, I learned CJ guides his readers through the tangled underbrush of crime, conscience, and consequence, all against the stunning and sometimes unforgiving backdrop of the American West. The two phrases really resonated with me, given my legal background and my cramped sense of literary adventure. First, it says, C.J. Box's fiction invites us to think critically and compassionately about justice. I think critically and compassionately about justice every day on the Wyoming Supreme Court. So perhaps CJ and I have even more in common than I ever appreciated, and I intend to explore that. Second, ChatGPT complimented CJ as being one of the most insightful voices at the crossroads of crime fiction and the American legal imagination. The American legal imagination? What exactly is that? Do I have any? Do I need some? Does it go beyond thinking critically and compassionately about the law? According to Google AI, legal imagination is the ability to think creatively about the law, to understand and shape its meaning and practice. It involves using creativity, empathy, and an understanding of narrative and language to develop new legal strategies, better interpret the law, and see legal possibilities that are not yet obvious. Wow. I'm afraid my legal imagination tank might be a little bit low. So, how lucky am I, how lucky are we to be here this afternoon to have our tanks filled? Please join me now in welcoming my friend Chuck Box, known to readers around the world, including a man I met in a pub in London one night, as C.J. Box, the author. We're glad to have you with us.
I'm glad Lynne confessed that she's never read one of my books, so I wouldn't have to bring that up. Her husband has read them all, though, so that makes up for it. This is a very kind of strange and overwhelming honor for me, this entire symposium. I had no idea what a law symposium was. It's extremely well organized. Thank you for inviting me. I've been, like I said, overwhelmed, actually, by so many of the speakers, and it makes me think, I'm really not that smart on these things. And some of the things they point out, I think, wow, I've never thought about that before. I'm not an oracle in the law or anything else. I write fiction. But one thing I thought about today when they're talking is that so many Wyoming issues involve legal issues. I never thought of it that way before. We are the tip of the spear in so many different things. When I first started out to write fiction 30 years ago now, I wanted to write a book that was true to what my vision of Wyoming was. And that is not people who speak kind of with Southern accents and say we're going to go down the road a piece and everybody's a caricature from a Western movie. I wanted to include things like what I considered, tip of the spear issues that we all know about in Wyoming, like energy development, wilderness, individualism, environmentalism, outfitters and guides, hunting and fishing culture, federal versus state versus local control, wildlife management, endangered species law, outdoor and Western culture. And I really didn't have an agenda, and I still don't. I like to explore those issues, but as anyone who knows the books knows, I try not to preach or convince the reader that there's only one way to view these issues. I think by exposing them on both sides, I trust the reader to come down where they will. I've always tried to do that. There's a quote by a favorite novelist of mine from Richard Price that it said, "Circle around a homicide long enough and you begin to get a sense of the city." And what he's saying is that through a crime or procedural novel or mystery, however you want to call them, what you're really doing is you're exposing a community. You're peeling back layers of a place in a very interesting way that can't be done in many cases in any other kind of fiction, and in some kinds in nonfiction. So through the investigation, you learn more about the people and the culture and what people care about, and that's what I always wanted to do, and that's what I still try to do with every book. When I think about certain authors who kind of own their places that they write about, I think about like James Lee Burke when he writes about Louisiana, or Raymond Chandler, or Michael Connelly when they write about LA, or John Sanford's Minnesota, or Cormac McCarthy's Texas. I wanted to be able to, through the books, show people outside of the state and people in the state what a snapshot of us is right now. And so that someday people looking back wondering what it was like would read the books and say that's what it was like back then. So it took me 20 years to come up with the first book that I called Joe Pickett. And it was about the endangered species law, how well-meaning legislation goes awry on the ground sometimes. We heard a lot about that today, but I based it all on the discovery of black-footed ferrets around Meeteetse so many years ago, and what really happened then as a result of that. And I thought that was a fascinating kind of New West issue. And I thought, when I was first writing it, I was going to have the protagonist be a sheriff, And then he was a journalist, which is what I was at the time. And then I was, as a journalist in Saratoga, Wyoming, I was going on ride-alongs with a local game warden. And I realized the game warden would be the best protagonist of this story because of the resource-based issues. He'd be out, he'd be among the landowners. I never thought there would be a second Joe Pickett novel. I didn't think the world is waiting for a Wyoming game warden series. You know, there was a book about a thing, and it took 20 years. And when I finally got it done, I got an agent in New York. This is pre-internet, so I had to physically send the manuscript through the mail to a guy who had expressed interest, an agent in New York. And then I waited 2 years, 3 years, nothing happening. I'd call him, and he would, in his brusque New York way, would say, I can't place this novel, it's too different, it's not really it's fit a genre, it's set in a place nobody knows anything about. It's about a game warden, for God's sake, you know. Quit calling me, I'll let you know if something happens. So 2 more years went by. And then I was getting frustrated because I thought my wife said the novel was good enough to be published, so I believed her. Finally went to a conference in Denver where you pitch novels, and I pitched this to a different agent, and he was interested, and he said, do you have an agent? And I said, yes, but nothing's happening. And he said, what's his name? I told him his name, and he said, you don't know he's dead, do you? He'd been dead for about 9 months at that point. But the story about this guy from Wyoming with the dead agent got around this whole conference, and it was a 24-year-old editor from Putnam, Penguin Putnam, heard this story and was kind of intrigued by the book, and she contacted me, and then they offered a contract for 2 more Joe Pickett books, so the series was born at that point. And now it's 26 years later, 26 Joe Pickett books later. Some of the great rewards have come around. The books have really been embraced in Wyoming and the Mountain West, which has always been my goal. A lot of themes that I thought were local turn out to be national and international when it comes to all these issues I was talking about earlier. Great thing is that a lot of men and boys read these books, and that's unusual. And I used to tell the publishers, I think my readership is about 50-50 men and women, and they did not believe me because that doesn't happen in publishing. Women read mysteries, men read thrillers. And I was seeing, you know, at every signing, husbands and wives, moms and boys, and they finally did a focus group and found out my readership is exactly 50-50 men and women. And it was not designed to be that way, but I'm grateful that it is. And the books are now in 27 languages, doing well. I mentioned the 26th book will come out in February. 7 of them have been #1 New York Times bestsellers. There's been 2 television series based on them. And now this, a Wyoming Law Review Symposium. So I think I've made it. Thank you.
Well, we are awfully grateful to have you here, and it's almost unreal for me to be sitting here on the stage and in front of all of you. But we'll start off with just a little bit about your background. So, you're a Wyoming native, avid outdoorsman, entrepreneur. You've worked as a ranch hand, surveyor, newspaper reporter, journalist. It seems like you've kind of done it all.
Can't keep a job.
How did these experiences and your Wyoming background really help shape your storytelling?
Well, they definitely have. But one thing that I don't put so much in the resume and the bio is that I was involved in the international tourism industry for almost 30 years, first with the state of Wyoming, and then with a company of our own, and part of the job was to lead tours of travel agents and foreign journalists around the state and around the region. And I got to know this state so well by doing that, and it also made me realize things that I took for granted were very unique through their eyes of foreign journalists and so on. And I thought when I finally wrote this book, I would try to include things that we see every day but don't think about, that are very interesting to other people and other readers. And it always amazes me when I go on book tours, whether it's U.S. or internationally, they always ask questions. More of the questions are about the place than the plot, by any means, and certainly not that many about the issues. But things like snow fences, they don't know what they are. I remember once with a group of French journalists who had to stop at every rest area because they all have to smoke cigarettes. And one of them wandered off into the trees in the bighorns and came running back because there were elk hanging in trees, and they thought they'd found some kind of witch encounter, Never seen anything like this before. And I try to include that sort of stuff. So now when I write, I don't ever think things are mundane. I want to include them.
So you've kind of touched on your writing process, and we kind of want to ask you a little bit more about that. When you sit down to write, what does your routine look like? Are you highly disciplined? You're sitting down for X amount of hours? Or are you inspiration-based? I mean, you said that this has evolved over 26 years, you said?
Yes.
How has that changed from when you first started to now?
It hasn't changed from the very first book, really, and there is no right way, wrong way. But for me, I always start with the issue first, and then do that. Whether it's like let's say wind energy development. We spoke a little bit, or some speakers talked about that today. Some of the issues involved in that, how controversial it can be in both sides. So what I usually do, I do the research that on my own. I try to find experts in the field on both sides of the controversy, so I can portray both sides as accurately as I can. And in some cases, I'll go do the things that Joe Pickett is going to do in the book. And that's cool stuff sometimes, like, multi-day pack trips in Yellowstone, or, raft trips, or I climbed a wind turbine all the way to the top. I thought they had elevators. They do not. They have ladders, and the thing sways in the wind as you go up. And then I wrote about that, but there's no way I could have known that without having done it. So first I do all that. I lay the groundwork, and then the way I look at it is, how can I pull the reader through this issue in a page-turning way? And then I do a bullet point outline from the beginning to the end. And then I start writing, and I literally write on top of the outline, and 1,000 words a day minimum. Some days it's 4,000 or 5,000 words, but that's the minimum. And then I just push all the way through the book. Every day I edit what I wrote the day before, push it forward, edit, push it forward, and then finally get to the contractually obligated 83 to 85,000 words. And then it goes. My process after the manuscript is done is, my wife is the first reader. She's my best editor. So she gives me notes, and my 3 daughters get it, and they give me notes. Then my agent gets it, she gives me notes, and then it goes to the editor.
So in your intro, you talked a little bit about how you chose a game warden as the main character rather than a police officer, lawyer, cowboy, or any type of other character in Wyoming. Can you talk a little bit about why you chose a game warden rather than those other types of characters?
Well, part of it was from doing those ride-alongs, and I realized the game warden, and that was a good panel today. Game wardens are involved in so many different aspects. They're not just law enforcement officers. There's landowner relations. They're involved in, making recommendations on hunting seasons. They're out in the field. They're involved. There's only 50 of them in the state of Wyoming. I've met some. I wrote the book before I really started going on ride-alongs with game wardens. But what I found was that so many of them were like Joe Pickett. I couldn't believe it. And how many of their wives were like Mary Beth, much smarter, living in state-owned, isolated homes, and really serving as the staff for the game warden, whether they wanted to or not. And I just found that to be really a compelling kind of situation, because I like the family aspect, the fact that the guy is out every day, not behind a desk, and not necessarily solving murders, but somehow always being involved in them, or being around them in some way. And they could deal with all the natural resource kind of issues I wanted to write about, where a sheriff would not be, So that's how. And I'm still happy that I chose a game warden, and that continues to be popular.
So as we've seen today from all of our presenters, there are countless legal issues that are prevalent in the American West. How do you go about selecting specific issues to examine in your books, and then a little bit, how do you go about researching those, and kind of what does your research process look like?
Like I said, some of it just comes from, I live around Saratoga. We have a little ranch there. Little things, the things I hear people talk about in the post office or in the grocery store, or things, issues that are on people's mind or that I've read about, or, start there, and then, like I said, seek out experts on both sides. Some of the books are more thrillers than mysteries, and they all kind of vary. But what I've found, I've never had anyone ever turn me down when I said that I would like to interview them about their job or about their advocacy or whatever. People love to tell you what they do, and no one ever asks. So I ask, and I've also found the whole journalism trick. If you walk up to somebody with an empty notebook, they feel compelled to fill it. And people start telling me things they should never tell me. I wrote one book about a group of bad guys in the Red Desert that were going to take down a huge data center, a governmental data center. And so I went to the data center in Cheyenne and to the engineer, who at first was a little reticent, but by the end of that session, he was telling me how he would just take that place down, and how easy it would be to do it. And I finally said, that's enough, stop. Because that's all they think about all day, and that way, that kind of information, I choke it back. I don't really say how to do it, but I learned how to do it, but I enjoy the research part of it as much as anything before the actual writing.
Gotcha. So with as much research as you do and getting both sides and involving the public as much as you do, are you ever surprised at the way readers sometimes interpret the way your work comes out? Have you become conscious of that, or has it been a very straightforward interpretation of your works?
I think in most cases it's very straightforward. I think the only time Professor Kalt is here, and you heard his story about the free fire in the zone of death sort of thing. I was a little concerned when I wrote that book that some people would get ideas and want to take their mother-in-law to Yellowstone Park. But it's never happened. And there would be too many crimes that they would have to come. You can't take somebody there and kill them, because that's other crimes. So, but I was concerned about that one, and we tried to, what we could do to maybe get the legislation that would close that loophole, but still hasn't worked. And maybe one of these days somebody will die there, and then we'll get our vindication, and maybe they'll close the loophole.
For aspiring writers who want to write about a specific place or just write a novel in general, do you have any advice that you would give them about avoiding cliche or just the process in general?
Yeah, I do talk to it's usually because I travel a lot, and there's always going to be somebody in the line for a book signing line who says, I've written, I'm a fledgling author, what should I do? And sometimes I'm kind of mean to them, and I say, what do you read? And if they don't read, it's amazing how many fledgling authors do not read other than their own stuff. And they're in love with their own voice, but they don't read widely. And that's my first, as trite as it sounds, I always tell them, you need to read outside your genre, you need to read successful books and deconstruct them to figure out why they're successful, and step out of your little bubble and realize that people aren't interested in you in order to write this book. You're conveying information, you're communicating, it's not about what's in your head. And that's probably my best advice. And then also, I tend to think journalism training is better than creative writing training to write the kind of commercial books that I do. I actually did I taught a short class here for the MFA program a few years ago, and I told all my 6 or 7 students, you should drop this class and not have don't go for an MFA in creative writing. Go do something, do other things so you can write about it and not just what's in your head. I've not been invited back to the University of Wyoming.
So in your initial address, you mentioned a handful of authors that might have helped, inspire you originally. Do any specific author, or did any specific authors or books influence you early on, and do you still see those impacts? And is that kind of an evolving thing where new authors are starting to impact you as well?
Oh, yeah, yeah, there's so, I have created a list of authors that are my favorite authors that now is going into I think 55 or something. I'm not going to even try to repeat them all to you. But early on influences, I read Catch-22 at a really young age, and that's still my favorite book. And I've read it 3 times or 4 times since. And every time I read it, I get something more out of it because I'm in a different stage in life. That was a big one. The Big Sky, it was another very influential one for me. All of Cormac McCarthy's novels, Raymond Chandler's novels, those are just some. And I think it used to be when I was writing, I would try not to read books that really had a strong style because I was afraid that I would just steal them. And then I realized if they're really that good, I want to steal them. So I don't shy away from reading anything while I'm writing now. I used to, but because there's some great stylists, and I don't see genre as a thing. I always know when I'm at a conference and somebody comes up and says, "I'm a literary author," kind of looking down their nose at me. What they're saying is, "I don't sell any books, but I get grants."
So you've touched on how you like to go and live the Joe Pickett experience.
Yes.
Which one's been your favorite to do so far? I mean, which book's been your favorite to research and live and step in those footsteps?
Well, I think I wrote a book called Back of Beyond, which was about a multi-day Yellowstone pack trip. And I went and did that pack trip and then wrote about the book and just the group dynamics that is involved and how expertly these guides and outfitters can kind of, because they're stuck with a group of people day after day, 24/7, how they can kind of manage these people, and that's really their job. Their job's also to point out the bears, but also it's just people management, and I really enjoyed that. Plus I love being in Yellowstone for that long, and then also researching a lot of the Yellowstone lore for the book Free Fire, the one that's set there. I went up and interviewed both Park Service people and concessionaires, and said, "Tell me all," because they clash all the time, Park Service versus the concessionaires. So I'd say, tell the concessionaires, "Tell me the worst thing about the Park Service," and then, "What's the worst thing about the concessionaires?" And boy, would they like to tell me that stuff. And I really felt like I wrote an inside-out novel about Yellowstone that no one else has. So I enjoy that.
I think building off of that, what do you think are the biggest legal or environmental issues currently impacting Wyoming, and do you foresee those playing a role in the next Joe Pickett stories, in the next Joe Pickett books, or his character development?
Well, I think legal, and I've hit on some of it. I've already covered some of it, but I think the newest thing is, gigantic AI centers. The issues with water and electricity and where you build them, and what the impact of all of those big centers going to be. Are there enough windmills to power them? No. How are they going to power? That's a huge issue, and Wyoming's right on the tip of the spear on that issue. Like I said, I have covered that stuff a little bit. But other things are a little more obscure that I find really interesting. I wrote a book a couple years ago about data mining centers that are out in the middle of nowhere that are placed on top of old oil or gas wells. The gas powers the electricity, which powers the data mining, or the Bitcoin mining center. And they're mining Bitcoin in the middle of nowhere, and hardly anybody knows about it.
So going back to kind of your beginnings and things like that, if you could go back and give yourself one piece of advice before publishing your first novel, what would it be?
Wow, get a healthy agent. I didn't know anything about the publishing world is a weird world, and I didn't know anything about that at the time, and I'm glad, one thing I am glad is I was never a starving artist just waiting for the phone to ring or for, get to receive a letter. I just went ahead and went to work and kept doing things. And in fact, the first book, we have 3 daughters. They never knew I wrote. I never told them I was working. They knew I had a home office. They knew I was doing something in there, but they didn't know I was writing a novel because I never wanted my girls to think my dad, the failed novelist. And they did not know I wrote until I had a book contract. And I showed it, and they were like 14, and their reaction was, "Dad, you're too dumb to have written a book. Really, a real book, But I think I don't have that many regrets because I think you've got to live your life first before you start writing. I think 20-year-old novelists don't know very much about anything.
So then at what point in your career did you realize you've made it as a writer?
It was literally, I could tell you, I think it was book 8. I was still working full-time, still involved in the international travel company. I was traveling overseas. I was writing in hotel rooms. I was writing on airplanes. And finally, with book 8, I was making more money from books than I was from my business. And I realized that's the time. But up until then, I was working full-time. That's a big thing, and a mistake I see a lot of novelists make is they write a book and then they quit their job. And I can think of a bunch of lawyer authors, friends of mine, because they want to not be lawyers anymore. They write that book and they get it published, and then they quit and they move to Hawaii, and then the book 2 fails and they don't get a 3rd book contract, and then they're stuck.
So that was when you decided to be a full-time writer, stick to it, or did you always want to have something going on the side as well?
No, I mean, that was always my goal, but I with the family and a business, I didn't feel like I could just stop and just do that. And so, like I said, it wasn't until the 9th year and 9 books out that I finally said I'm full-time.
Do you ever feel pressure to portray the legal system, law enforcement agencies, or other issues in a certain way, knowing that readers are probably going to make opinions based on your representations in your novels?
I don't know how to answer that question because I have a lot of corrupt, lawyers and law enforcement people and judges and all sorts of things. So I'm not sure how to answer that one. I do have a daughter who's an attorney, and she reads the book, so she'll give me, she helps with some of the legal issues. I don't know if I've answered your question. Does that answer your question? I mean, I don't think about it that much. I just, propel the story, and some people are going to be good, some people are going to be bad.
So, talking a little bit about your fan base, and obviously, as we've seen today, you seem to enjoy interacting with your fans. What's the most meaningful or memorable interaction that you've had with a fan, or if there are maybe a handful of interactions you've had that really impacted you on a deep level? If you could shed some light on that.
I can think of 2. There have been a lot of really interesting interactions. I remember being at a book signing in Sheridan where the person came up with the book, and she explained she was part of the Diversity Alliance. She was very much a very active environmentalist, and she said, "Thank you for getting it right." And right behind her was this outfitter who said, "Thank you for getting it right." And I thought, "Ooh, that's perfect. I've heard from both sides. That's good." But I can think of 2 kind of just off the weird interactions. One, I was in Alabama, and this guy came up, and he had a piece of cardboard, laminated cardboard, with 5 authors on it and all of their books listed. And he came up and asked me to sign the books, and I said, "What are you doing? Is this all the books you've read?" And he explained that he had been in a car wreck and had brain damage and had no long-term memory. So he had made this card of all the authors that he liked so that he just reread the books. because he couldn't remember them later. And then his wife would then write the new book down. So he'd like reread my books like 13 times, and he was always surprised. He said, and I thought wow. But then there was one, it was at a library conference in Idaho. And I was the lunchtime speaker, and I was at a table with all these librarians, and they were all talking about the fact that how cool it was that men were coming into their little rural libraries and checking out the books, because they just didn't see a lot of men. Isn't that great? And they were going on, and there was one librarian in particular who was really sour the whole time during the whole discussion, and I noticed she was, shaking her head when they were talking to her, and then finally one of them said to her, "Aren't his books popular in your library too?" And she said, "Yes, I am, but I cannot endorse a gay Mormon." And they said, game warden. This is Idaho. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't really know how to follow that one up. So I guess I'm just going to roughly transition to a fun question.
Okay.
You love doing the research and learning. If there was anybody from history that you could sit down and have dinner with and have a great conversation with, who would it be?
It would be either Mark Twain or Theodore Roosevelt. I think of Theodore Roosevelt, I'd never get a word in edgewise, but I'm fascinated by him as a figure and a writer and a president and all the things he did, and Mark Twain as the quintessential American writer.
So here in a second, we'll open it up to the crowd for questions. We have a handful of questions that were submitted through the box that we'll start off with. The first one, when will poor Nate ever get a break?
That was going to be, when will poor Joe ever get a break? I don't know. Michael Connolly is one of my favorite authors, and he's very successful. And he's got to have tension on every page. That's your goal as an author, tension on every page. So if everybody, like during the Game and Fish panel, when the guys were saying, "Boy, we get along great with all our federal partners," I'm thinking, what a boring book that would be. So the same with Nate, same with Joe. And I remember, if they're just reading about somebody's glowing life going on from success to success, that might be interesting, but it's a lot better with tension and violence and, weird character development and twists throughout. So I don't know when. I don't think about when he's going to get a break. He has certain little periods of happiness, and then they all just get destroyed.
This is also a question that we got submitted through the box outside. Was falconry an interest previous to your writing career?
Yes, it was. That's another one of those things, that kind of life experiences that I wanted to incorporate in the book. When I was in college, actually when I was in high school in Casper, Wyoming, a friend of mine, a year ahead of me in high school, at Kelly Walsh High School, he was the middle linebacker on the football team, big blonde guy. He was a falconer, and I used to go falconry hunting with him. And he went on to the Air Force Academy into Special Forces, so I kind of based the Nate character on him. But as you probably saw, if you saw the demonstration, when you go falconry hunting, you don't hunt, you're the bird dog. I went with them. I never had falcons, but I just love falconry. I love the mindset. Falconers are all a little off. Is Valley still here? He's much more personable than most falconers, but they really do devote their entire lives to it, and knowing the possibility that what they're devoting their entire lives to could fly away and never come back at any minute, and so it's a different kind of mindset, very very red in tooth and claw,
So one more, and then we'll open it up for question. So it's more of a comment than anything. And someone put, I appreciate how Mary Beth is such a strong and intelligent female character. And I'll create a question from that. Are there any significant female characters in your life that really, other than maybe your wife and your daughters, that helped you kind of conceptualize Mary Beth? And develop her character over the years?
Oh, there are. I mean, I would say my family largely to that degree, because I have strong-willed wife and three very independent, strong-willed daughters, and they keep me on the straight and narrow. And I've written some books outside the Joe Pickett series about Cassie Duell, set in Montana, and from a woman's point of view, a female point of view. And sometimes I think when male authors do that, they really screw it up. And so in order to do that, I had to really think about it. And when I gave my wife and my daughters the first Cassie Duell book, I was scared to death. They were going to, it was like the dog that didn't bark. They came back with notes, but none of those notes were, a female would never think like this, do this, act like this. And the best way to sum it up, for the TV show Big Sky, the executive producer and writer is a guy named David E. Kelley, who's very famous and is famous for writing really strong female characters, if you followed his career at all. And when I talked to him on the phone the first time, he said, you really write women well. And I said, wow, coming from you, that means a lot. And he said, you know what? They're just like real people, aren't they? And what he was saying, it didn't mean it as bad as it sounded. What he said is when male authors write female characters, they tend to over-sexualize them or make them every woman's a kick-ass female, and not real women, not real people.
So with that, I think we'll open it up to the audience for questions.
So both Joe and Mary Beth have problematic parents.
Yes.
Joe's parents were terrible, and then Mary Beth's mother is awful.
Yes.
And so I guess I just wonder why that was the way that went, and especially Missy, like, she's so awful.
Yes, she is awful. Yes. And she's not based on my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law's worse. No, that's not true. My mother-in-law's not worse. I think the only reason I didn't think that deeply about it. It was the first book. Like I said, I didn't know it'd go on. But I thought what I liked the idea was that these two people were trying to create a really, really good family, and they didn't have any background in doing that. So they're clinging to each other to try to do that. And I liked that idea because I thought it said a lot about them. So it's fun writing the Missy character, actually.
Sure.
Yes.
What was the reason for the discontinuation of the Big Sky? I watched it as well as read your books, and it was pretty good. I liked it.
Good.
And was it spot on, or how much did it vary from your whole intention?
The first half of the first season of Big Sky, written by David E. Kelley, was very much based on the book The Highway. And I thought it was very well done and very well written and very compelling. See, as the author, I think as long as they're using my dialogue, then it's really good. And when they start inventing their own direction and characters and dialogue, I think it's bad. But that show continued for 3 seasons, but they were doing their own thing by the end of the third. I had no idea. My wife and I would watch it. We'd hate watch it and see what they were going to come up with this week. And the only thing that we could say that was, wow, man, I'm really being negative. We just go ka-ching. That's the only good thing.
You talked about the research that you do, and I'm just wondering, can Nate really talk to the animals, and is Eric a thing?
Well, I mean, obviously, there's got a suspension of belief on some of these things. Like I said, I based that character on a friend of mine who I'm still friends with, who I have been with him when he's done things that don't make any logical sense. Usually, he would go hunting in Casper he'd get in a drift boat and he'd float down the North Platte, and where by the time he pulled out, he'd have a deer and an elk and an antelope. And I would say, how do you do that? And he said, I just let them come to me. And I don't know what he meant, but he's known for these kind of things. And he still is. I don't see he talks to animals. He just thinks of nature in a different way and interacts with it in a way that I don't understand.
You mentioned how much fun you have writing Disney. I was curious about the characters that are maybe loosely based on real people in Wyoming. The governor, maybe, Marcus
yeah.
Hand. How do you handle those, and do you talk to the actual people before you do that?
No. Like the governor was actually not based on a Wyoming governor. In my mind, he was based on Governor Jankel of South Dakota. And when in my tourism job, we used to work with the state of South Dakota, so it wasn't based on any Wyoming governor. What I have found is that whenever I really want to get revenge on somebody or somebody I really dislike, I will write them as accurately as I can in the book, and everyone else in the circle will realize who I'm writing about, except that person. They never recognize themselves.
Do you personally have a favorite book out of all those books you've written now? I mean, your characters have developed, they've gone, Do you have a favorite book?
I don't. I have, I guess, several favorites. I would put it that way. One is Open Season because it was the first book, and also because it built the scaffolding for 26 books after it. I never have to regret anything I wrote in that first book. Sometimes I've talked to other authors who sometimes start as they don't know they're starting a long series either, but their characters are too old when they in the first book. So then 10 years down the road, they're wondering, what am I going to do with this geriatric detective? So I'm really fond of that because it holds up. The other book I'm very proud of is one called Blue Heaven. That's an absolute standalone. That book is technically really difficult because it's 7 characters told in real time over 72 hours from their points of view. So if you read that book and you don't think about that, then that's good. But that book was very technically hard, but it won the Edgar Allan Poe Award for that year, and that's another one. And then I would say Free Fire, because it was set in Yellowstone, which I'd been to 200 times at that point, and it was so much fun to write. The newest one, the one I just finished, is always my favorite.
You have lots of different stories, and I was wondering if you've ever started one and then you're like, oh, I'm not into this anymore, and set it aside. And if you have, do you pick it back up, or no, if you start a story, you finish it?
Well, I basically I've rejected some ideas in the research part of it, or the issue part of it, or laying the groundwork part of it, and gone a different direction, but never started writing a book and got halfway in and thought, I'm not liking this. That's done. I reject the early stuff. So I've been lucky that way.
I love your portrayal of Wyoming in the books. What makes you most proud about being a Wyomingite?
Well, I mean, so many things, but I mean, one of the things, and I've mentioned it, we all know this, is that, I think Wyoming is the one remaining state, used to be Alaska, but I think it's just Wyoming, where there's only 1 degree of separation between everybody in the state. If you don't know somebody in that town, you know somebody who knows that person in that town. And that still exists in Wyoming, so there's a certain kind of intimacy that I don't think exists anywhere else, even though people do different things and move around. The other things I love about Wyoming is that people choose to live here, even though they can make a lot more money in other places because they just like the lifestyle so much. And I like that. There's too many things to count. But overall, I mean, that's it.
So we've got a couple of questions online. The first one, do you ever feel pigeonholed to write within the Western genre, and have you ever considered expanding to other genres?
I don't think I'm in the Western genre. I write contemporary mystery crime thrillers set in the West, but they're not Westerns. So no, I know I've written books set in Idaho, Montana, Colorado, North Dakota, but primarily Wyoming. But I'm going to stick in the West because I know it, and because I couldn't set a book on the Eastern Seaboard. I wouldn't even know where to start. I'm not familiar enough. So I write about areas I know of and places I've been.
So would you say, no, I don't want to ask my question. So with one of your daughters going into law, question one, did your writing or anything influence her career path? And then two, what are your other two daughters doing?
Has my writing influenced the daughter who went into law? I'm not so sure that it did, other than I think if any of my daughters is likely to write a novel, it would be her, probably. She's a very good writer, and I think she learned to be a good writer by legal writing. She's very good. All three daughters write well. Then another daughter's a graphic artist who does all my social media and all of that. And the other daughter is a physical therapist. And the empathetic one, the young one,
Perfect. So another question that we got online was, with the recent helicopter roundups of wild horses, do you envision that being integrated into your storytelling at all, or would you address that?
No, I've been asked that several times, and that's something I think I might explore more in the future is the whole wild horse. I've touched on it a little bit, but I haven't written a book with that as a central thing, but I'm interested, I'm intrigued by the idea. I'm not sure how to build that one yet, but it's kind of in my pot of something to explore in the future.
Corner crossing, is that something you might entertain as well?
I already have.
It's in your backyard?
It's in the last several books. And it's not the main part of the book, but that's one of the reasons that was addressed today, was the issue was brought up in several of the books from the point of view of the rancher and the foreman who asked Joe to go get these corner crossers. Again, the state being so small, where I live, my wife was actually in the jury pool for that trial, and she had to, during the process, she said, yes, I know the landowner, and yes, this defense attorney stayed at our house last week with our daughter, so she was not on the jury.
So normal people don't just read law review articles. So I am powerfully curious how you came across Brian Kalt's article in the first place.
It was forwarded to me by several readers, and because I didn't read the article straight out. I read articles about it, and then was intrigued by the idea, and then contacted Brian, and then got his law review article and read it. And then luckily Brian was kind enough, as I was writing the book, to to say you've got this right, you've got this wrong, you've got more nuance here, kind of thing. So that I wanted to make sure that was accurate as well. But no, I'm not going out reading law review articles. But that's one I did read. And then also when with the whole premise, I took it to Judge Johnson, Alan Johnson. I was on the Cheyenne Frontier Days board with him, and I knew that he would be a judge who could possibly hear a case like that if it was set in the Wyoming jurisdiction. And I said, I'm not asking you to prejudge it, but is it legitimate? Would it get as far as you? And he said, yes, it would. Because he didn't say, that it was a legitimate defense or not, but he said it's a legitimate issue. So I felt comfortable enough with going with it.
I have always loved your descriptive passages about Wyoming.
Thank you.
And you just do a beautiful job. There's that place near Doyle Creek that I know. And so do you still, because now you have your process and then you have to go out and do book tourism, do you get enough time out in Wyoming that it still gets to inspire you and you can see your next setting you want to go to?
Yes, the answer is yes to that. And I find, even though I've been to these many places before, including my hometown now, Saratoga, when I'm going to write, I know I'm going to set the book there, I just go and look at everything and make notes as if it's the first time I was there. This next week, I'm going to go to Afton, because I've not set a book over there yet. And I've been there many times, but I'm going to go over there solely to soak it up, re-soak it up, and make notes and get it my head right about that part of the state before I start the next book.
So, as many of the attorneys and law students in the room know, writing is a crucial portion of what we do, and being a lawyer is, in a sense, being a professional writer. What tips do you have for us to develop strong prose and strong writing skills as we either are getting ready to enter the legal field or as we continue to practice and finding ways to become better writers?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I have the expertise to answer, other than just pure clarity and simplicity in writing is the most important thing. Not showing off, not pulling terms that aren't, never use 10 words when one word will do. Just simplicity and clarity, I think, is the most important thing.
Just curious, why Aspen?
Afton. No books. I did set some things in Aspen, Colorado once, but this one's going to be that part of the state.
So,
Of course.
So in a couple of the novels that I'm thinking of, there's a wolf that Joe seems to see in places where there aren't supposed to be any wolves.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, first of all, do you know something we don't know? And my second question is, are we going to hear from this wolf again in the future?
Probably. Where that comes from is the fact that, when I mentioned Yellowstone, in the wolf reintroduction in Yellowstone, I was working in Yellowstone with people on the concessionaire side and Park Service who were seeing wolves before they were reintroduced. They were there. They were reintroducing themselves. And it's always stuck with me that, those animals were there, maybe not huge numbers, but they were moving in. So the big reintroduction was partly political theater, and that's always stuck with me. There's, we saw wolves in southeastern Wyoming around Saratoga in the Sierra Madres years before they were introduced in Colorado. So they were there. They're there. So that's one thing. I just, there may be legal boundaries, but nobody told the wolves that. Same with grizzly bears.
so I think this next question is going to have to be our last one. Do you envision a way for Joe to adopt or mentor a character who becomes a son or future grandson to whom he can pass the torch to continue the story?
I never think that far in advance. I go from book to book to book. So I don't have an overall arc where that will happen. To some degree, well, the book that's coming out in February is more about Joe Pickett's daughters, told from their points of view. Very first chapter, Joe Pickett is found shot up in a pickup truck and got shot in the head. And he's airlifted to Montana, and while he's there, the three daughters get together and try to see if they can figure out who did it. So they're all kind of playing detective for their own way. So maybe one of them, but I don't think that far in advance. I'm not telling, and then, by the way, that's not a spoiler. It's going to be in the, jacket flap.
Well, thank you, and if everyone will join me in saying thanks with a big round of applause.
Thank you.